1903, a field collector working under contract with the Bureau of American Ethnology submitted a report to Washington that included, among its appendices, a reference to skeletal remains described as anomalously proportioned. The remains had been excavated from a burial mound near the confluence of the Kanawha and Ohio rivers in what is now West Virginia. The report was received, logged, and filed. There is no follow-up correspondence in the public record. Field reports from that era were inconsistent in their documentation. Collectors used different measurement conventions. Terms like large or giant weren't standardized. But this particular case is worth looking at more carefully. Not because of what the record says, but because of what happens to it afterward. The Smithsonian Institution's Bureau of American Ethnology was, by the turn of the 20th century, the most active archaeological organization in the United States. Between 1882 and 1920, it conducted or supervised hundreds of mound excavations across the eastern seaboard and the Midwest. The scale of that effort produced an enormous amount of physical material: pottery, tools, ornaments, and human remains, along with an equally large paper trail. Most of those records are accessible today through the National Anthropological Archives in Suitland, Maryland. Researchers can request finding aids, correspondence, field notes, and photographic catalogues going back to the 1870s. The system is imperfect, as any archive that size would be. Records are misfiled. Some boxes haven't been processed, but the general structure of the collection is coherent, which makes certain gaps harder to explain on purely administrative grounds. Starting in the 1880s, newspaper coverage of mound excavations in Ohio, Indiana, and the Tennessee Valley regularly included descriptions of skeletal remains said to be unusually tall. Reports from local journalists and county historians, not sensationalist publications, but local papers covering civic events, mentioned figures ranging from 6.5 feet to, in some cases, well over 7. Accounts from Chillicothe, Ohio in 1886, from Dunleith, Illinois in 1874, from Sayre, Pennsylvania in 1916. The Pennsylvania case is often cited in this context. According to contemporary reporting, workers excavating a mound uncovered multiple skeletons with skulls described as notably elongated and with femur lengths suggesting unusual height. The find was said to have been examined by a professor from a Pennsylvania state institution, though the name varies across accounts. No formal publication of those measurements has been located. That's where most of these stories end. A local report, a brief mention, and then nothing. The question isn't whether giant humans once populated North America. The anthropological consensus on that is clear enough. Average height in prehistoric populations varied, but not by the margins described in many of these accounts. The question is narrower than that. It's about documentation, specifically what happened to the physical records of excavations that mentioned anomalous remains during the Smithsonian's most active period of mound survey work. Cyrus Thomas was the director of the Division of Mound Exploration from 1882 to 1894. His 1894 report, published by the Bureau of American Ethnology, remains one of the most comprehensive surveys of eastern mound sites ever produced. It runs to over 700 pages. It catalogues thousands of artifacts and skeletal finds, and it addresses methodically the question of whether mound builders were a distinct, separate race from Native American populations, concluding that they were not. That conclusion was considered controversial at the time. It contradicted popular theories that had circulated for decades, theories that imagined a vanished civilization of builders quite different from the indigenous peoples Europeans had encountered. Thomas's report settled the scientific question in most professional circles, but it didn't fully extinguish the popular interest in the subject. And some researchers have argued, more recently, that in consolidating the official narrative, certain inconvenient finds may have been quietly set aside. That's a serious claim. It needs to be held carefully. In 2012, a researcher named Ross Hamilton, working outside academic institutions, submitted a Freedom of Information Act request to the Smithsonian seeking access to internal correspondence. related to skeletal remains from Ohio mound sites collected between 1880 and 1910. The institution's response acknowledged the request and indicated that relevant records, to the extent they existed, would be located within the NAA collections. Hamilton later stated publicly that he received a partial response and that several boxes of correspondence from that period appeared to have no surviving contents. Smithsonian staff, in a brief email exchange that was subsequently published on Hamilton's website, indicated that gaps in the correspondence record from that era were not unusual given the age of the materials and the conditions of early storage. That's a plausible explanation. Correspondence from the 1880s and 1890s was not uniformly preserved. There were fires, there were relocations. The Smithsonian moved physical collections multiple times across the 20th century. Still, the gaps Hamilton identified weren't random. They clustered around specific field seasons and specific collectors. One of those collectors was Gerard Folk, a field agent who worked for the Bureau of American Ethnology from roughly 1887 through the early 1900s. Folk was a productive excavator. He worked across West Virginia, Ohio, and Missouri. His published reports are detailed and generally well regarded by historians of the period. His unpublished correspondence is another matter. Within the NAA finding aids, Folk's materials are spread across at least 4 separate accessions. Researchers who have worked with those collections report that the materials are incomplete. One finding aid notation, visible in a digitized version of the NAA catalogue, references a box described as Folk Field Correspondence, 1889 to 1896, contents removed for conservation review. There is no subsequent notation indicating that the contents were returned or catalogued elsewhere. Conservation review is a real process. Materials are sometimes isolated for climate control work, particularly if there's mold or pest damage. That box may have been transferred to a different storage unit and simply misfiled in the finding aid, or the contents may have deteriorated beyond use. Neither of those explanations is unusual. Together, though, they create a pattern that's difficult to evaluate precisely because it's difficult to evaluate at all. The Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History holds a substantial collection of human skeletal remains. As of recent public reporting, the collection numbers in the tens of thousands of individuals, many of them the result of 19th century excavation programs. In the 1990s, the passage of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA, required the institution to conduct a systematic inventory of those remains and to begin the process of returning affiliated individuals to descendant communities. That process is ongoing. It's slow, and it has been criticized by tribal representatives for moving too cautiously. But it is documented. There are publicly accessible databases that list, by general category and approximate origin, the holdings subject to repatriation review. Several researchers who have examined those databases note that a subset of remains listed as culturally unaffiliated, meaning the Smithsonian has not yet identified a living descendant community, includes individuals from Ohio and West Virginia mound sites excavated in the late 19th century. The physical dimensions of those individuals are not typically included in the public database listings. That's standard practice. Detailed osteological data isn't part of the public NAGPRA inventory. You'd need to submit a research request to access that information, and access is conditional on institutional affiliation and research purpose. A 2004 internal review of the Natural History Museum's osteological collections, portions of which were later obtained through a records request and published by an independent researcher, noted that certain accessions from the BAE survey period lack associated documentation sufficient to establish collection provenance. The review recommended further archival investigation. Whether that investigation was conducted is not clear from the public record. The 2004 document itself is 6 pages. 3 pages of appendices were withheld from the released version under an exemption for internal deliberative materials. None of this confirms that remarkable skeletal remains were systematically suppressed. The more probable explanations for missing correspondence, incomplete accessions, and undocumented transfers are the ordinary ones: institutional disorder, Inadequate early preservation, the normal entropy of a very large and very old collection. What's harder to account for is the consistency of certain types of gaps. The mound excavation period, roughly 1880 to 1910, was the most active phase of federal archaeological survey work in the country's history. It was also the period during which the institutional consensus about mound builders was most actively being debated and settled. In that context, the handling of anomalous finds would have carried more institutional weight than in later decades. Thomas's 1894 report was deliberately comprehensive. It was written in part to close a question. And closing questions sometimes means deciding which evidence is central and which is peripheral. That's not unusual in scientific institutions. It happens in every field. There are a few documented cases where the trail is specific enough to follow a little further. An 1880 report by a Dr. J. F. Snyder, published in the Smithsonian Annual Report for that year, describes skeletal remains from an Illinois mound site with femur measurements he considered inconsistent with typical prehistoric dimensions. Snyder's report was included in that year's publication. His follow-up communication to the Bureau, referenced in a subsequent letter from a BAE administrative assistant, does not appear in the NAA holdings. The follow-up letter was apparently written in 1882. What it contained is unknown. Snyder died in 1921. His personal papers are held at the Illinois State Historical Library in Springfield. A finding aid for that collection, last updated in 1998, lists his correspondence files as partially processed. The relevant folders for 1881 and 1882 are described as fragile, restricted, pending conservation. That restriction was noted 26 years ago. There's no clean resolution to this. The archival record is incomplete in ways that are partly explainable and partly not. The Smithsonian has not, to the public record's knowledge, formally addressed the specific question of whether anomalous skeletal material from the mound survey period was handled differently than other material. Researchers who have asked that question directly have received responses that are accurate in their narrow framing but don't address the broader pattern. What's left is a collection of procedural anomalies, missing folders, unreturned materials, and a 2004 internal review with 3 pages redacted. The Snyder correspondence hasn't been located. The folk boxes haven't been accounted for. The Illinois folders are still listed as restricted. Maybe they've deteriorated past the point of recovery. Maybe they were consolidated into another accession and the finding aid was never updated. Maybe someone looked at the contents in 1998 and decided they didn't add much. Those are all reasonable possibilities. The folders remain closed.